So, Jane, we've known each other for a while. I was actually trying to think about how many years it's been since we first connected, and I've always had a real interest in your work, and I know we've had many conversations over the years. So, I wondered if you would be happy to introduce yourself, just so the group can hear you bring your work a little bit to life, if that's okay.
Yes, of course, Damien, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be in this dialogue with you, Damien. And I think it's going back, I think we're going back 20 years or so. It's quite a long time, isn't it? And that's, it's been a great pleasure to be on a coaching development journey with you in lots of different ways. Um, just a bit about myself. I mean, I guess I always describe myself as a whole career in um, development, people development. I mean, in the old days, I started off in what used to be called personnel management, became HR, and then essentially moved into consultancy and became an OD consultant, I suppose, 25, 30 years ago, really, and then have moved into coaching latterly. That's essentially my career story in terms of wider life. I live in Yorkshire. I was born and brought up in Yorkshire. I've worked quite a lot in London. And I have two children who are grown up and married and live between Leeds and Harrogate. That's a sort of quick potted history.
Thanks, Shane. Thank you. And I mean, I'm obviously aware of the book that you published and your doctoral research as well. So I wondered if we could just start perhaps by inviting you to share a little bit about your research and how that's evolved in terms of organizational and leadership wisdom.
Yes, thank you. I think Damon is probably right that I was already interested in it when we first met. And when I look back, that was very much the early stage of exploration for me. And in essence, I mean, if I look back, I got interested in the notions of what was going on in organizations, I think probably towards the end of the financial crisis, really. And if you think back, what was going on in the financial crisis, which was about 2008, 9, wasn't it? But what had preceded that and what was around it, things like um, mid-staff's inquiry in health, phone hacking, MPs' expenses, Hillsborough, those sorts of organisational issues had started to fascinate me about what wasn't right in organisations. That's not to say there isn't lots that's good in organisations, and I firmly believe that. But I got interested in studying what was going on and started to explore sort of ethics in organizations. But as I started to read around that, and I was doing a doctorate which started with the word ethics in the title, I started to find more and more writing around wisdom rather than ethics necessarily. And for me, I think it just blew open a bigger concept, a more holistic concept, a more integrative concept. And that's what I've kind of pursued, really. Um, I mean, we had the pleasure a few minutes ago of having a bit of a pre-conversation with you, and I think it's not funny, but I was reflecting that the fact, if you were to say, are the ethical and wisdom challenges, how have they evolved? Well, let's watch the news today. It's right at the front and centre, isn't it, of what's going on at the moment. So I think in the literature on wisdom since the 2000s, there's been a kind of explosion in writing around organizational wisdom. In the practice and what's going on the ground, I would be less sure that it's making as much difference as I would like it to.
Mm,
So I don't know if that
yeah.
is a point to stop.
Well, and I'm sure um, the people listening to this conversation can really relate to what you're sharing. And I suppose as I use, I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you mean. I know this is probably the billion-dollar question, but what you mean when you talk about organizational wisdom.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's a really, really good question, isn't it? And I've always resisted pinning down a trite definition because I think wisdom is such a mysterious and kind of holistic concept. It's quite difficult to find words that everybody would agree with. But I do have some things that matter to me. And for me, I feel it is a sort of balancing of interests, really. My interests, your interests, our interests, the world's interests. And there's a tension in those. So that for me is the, how do we navigate what's good for all of us? And of course it's complicated because we have different interests at times and they pull against each other. So that's for me. I mean, some of the definitions that stick with me from the writers, one of the famous writers, the sort of person who started really the more recent study in organisation and psychology on wisdom is Robert Sternberg, and he has a balanced theory of wisdom, which says it's about our, those interests, but also over time. Some of the others I like. There's a UK academic. A lot of the study is from the US, but a UK academic, Nicholas Maxwell, and he talks about knowing what matters, knowing what really matters, what really matters. And I like, there's others who say things like, getting over yourself, really. Wisdom is like getting over yourself. It's not all about us or me. So those are some of them, but there's many, many definitions out there. But for me, it's about a balancing of interests, I think, really.
Yeah. And as you say that, Jane, my some of the underpinnings of my initial coach training was more transpersonal and the notion of spiritual intelligence, and
Yes.
I suppose that's the connection I'm making at the moment as you're describing, that sort of sense of the balance between the interests.
Yes. And
Uh,
Sternberg actually is quite rare amongst the writers that he does take it into the sort of spiritual transcendent. He says, there's me, there's us, there's our organisations and society, there's the planet. There might be something beyond that. So,
Mhm.
I think to have that is a very holistic
Yeah,
definition, isn't
yeah. And I know we're going to come on and talk about our current context in a moment. But I just wonder if before we get there, if perhaps you could just say a little bit more about where your work is evolving to at the moment.
Yes, I mean, I think it's always useful to say that I think I am first and foremost probably an organisational development person, really. I think I always have been. I like the whole system. I like the organisation, and I always see coaching as part of the offer. For me, it's part of an offer of thinking about. Often I'm working on leadership programs and different things where coaching is a part of it. Not always, but often it is. So I always see, in terms of the work broadly, I think it is about that kind of notion of wisdom at every level. But when it comes to coaching, I think it is, again, the notion of how the coaching practice is helping us think about the integrated situation, integration in the self, with others, in the wider world. So I think that's the kind of stick of rock thing for me, which is you know, how am I playing in all these levels of integration? That's I think what my work focuses on. And I don't know whether it's worth just saying, Damien, the most recent thing I'm involved in is setting up with a dear colleague, Rachel Day, something called a Centre for Wisdom and Balance, which is it's an online community mainly, but with a physical presence at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, where we're doing different things which are trying to sort of capture this centeredness of balance, of balancing of interests and integration. So that's kind of some of I suppose, the philosophical and then the practical things that I'm doing.
Mm, thank you. Thank you. And again, at the end, perhaps we can share the link to that in case people
Yeah,
are interested,
yeah,
Jane. Yeah, and so again, I noticed that sort of sense there. You were using the words center,
yes.
balance. Could you say a little bit more about
um, It's funny, when we called the Centre for Balance and Wisdom, Rachel and I played around with ideas around what we were emphasizing. And there was a moment where we both looked at each other and said, you know what, this is about the centre, and it is about being centered. And it was a kind of light bulb moment for us both, which was that, yeah, it's about when you're in a crisis, which I think, the term polycrisis is emerging, isn't it, around us at the moment? But how do you keep your balance, and how do you stay centered in a crisis? And so I think that notion of where's my center, where's our center, where operating from the center is really important, and it's the stuff we're exploring. So it's the stuff of the work I'm doing right now. But I don't have we don't have all the answers to it, but we're exploring what does balance mean. And I think again, we talked a bit, Damien, in previously about we're living in a society, aren't we, at the moment, where we've got this really strong sense of polarities and people pushing to the extremes. And I think again, philosophically really resist that, which is where's the center? There's how do you pull back to something which is more navigating through and not tolerating the polarities.
Mm.
And again, I hope I'm not being too controversial in saying this, but watching the news today, I find it painful watching both sides, as I'm sure we all do. But you've got really difficult things going on, haven't you, in the ethical landscape, and terrible things happened and have happened. But at the same time, that the sense I had to turn Radio 4 off this morning, because that sense of hounding people and hounding the players to the point where we're only satisfied when they've, it's almost like we're looking for sacrifice all the time. I find that really difficult.
Mm.
And I just don't think it's a good look on that side.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. And in some ways, I suppose we're inching into this sort of dialogue for today in terms of finding a wise path. And I know one of the questions that were posed in was, how coaches may contribute. So I just wonder if from your perspective, Jane, because you mentioned in the a moment ago around the polycrisis, and and the reality is that's coming into the coaching space. So this question around how coaches may contribute, I just wondered if you could perhaps say a couple of reflections from your side.
Yes, I think it's a difficult topic, isn't it, and a difficult question, because, and I have done other research about the extent to which you might challenge some of what are regarded as the mantras of traditional coaching. Does the coach have a more of a responsibility than we've suggested in our traditional coaching models of challenging ethical behavior and those sorts of things? Because we tend to play the very non-judgmental route, don't we? And I think it's quite difficult. But I asked you the question. You could ask me the question: what would happen if you were in front of a Peter Mandelson or somebody like that? What would you ask? What would you say? And I think there has been a risk in some of our coaching practice that we're a bit afraid of asking the difficult questions. Maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I think the notion of mirroring back and non-judgmental and so on can veer towards a kind of lack of challenge and critique of what's going on. So I think a willingness, the courage that it might call from sometimes to challenge things is important. And I think that's one thing. I think whether the polycrisis, whether there is stuff that we need to be doing more of in our coaching communities about learning how to deal with it together, and leaning into that, and how do we coach in that context and the sort of change of issues. I was saying to you earlier, Damien, I think when I first started coaching, the sort of issues that people brought were very much more sort of granular work related, performance related issues. And now they nearly always seem to me to be at the heart of really difficult tensions and relationships and dilemmas and so on. Now, I think you and I said earlier, it might be possibly because of my state and the sort of coaching I'm doing as much as anything else. But I just wonder whether we're ready for it as coaches. I just wonder whether we're having enough discussion about what that calls from us. and is there a risk that if you're not ready for it, you're a bit superficial? I sometimes fear that myself, it's so I think my posing the challenge would be, are we courageous enough as coaches to call out things that are worrying that we hear? And secondly, are we ready for it? Are we being developed enough to deal with it?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And I so it's just a couple of reflections I want to share as you said that. I think that the challenge is otherwise, um, an AI bot can be in that space itself where I suppose what we're leaning on here is when we're connected to that center, um,
yeah,
actually, um, as a coach, my capacity to use my intuition, my capacity to be provocative, to bring challenge in service of the coachee, but a wider system, um, comes from a very different place. So I suppose there's also something for me about how we're developing that capacity in ourselves to come from that place as well, Jane.
yes, and I mean, I think again, I'm sure on the community that sense of how you develop yourself perhaps becomes more important. So, as the evolution in your coaching practice comes a lot from who you are
Mm,
and what what you're paying attention to, doesn't it? But whether we're paying enough, whether there's more we could do as a community to learn about that and actively work together on it, I think interests me.
mm,
Um,
mm,
yeah. I mean, I think it would be wrong to say there's a single path as well, wouldn't it? There's many paths, I think, to to wise action, and so there are many things you could do. I don't know whether it's worth saying at the centre, and I'm going to credit my dear friend and colleague Rachel with a lot of this work. We are paying attention to a number of practices that we're using, and we're going to be using in our development work and in our coaching. And the practices are grounding. So, that sense of, and I think that is the centering, and we are physically going to be present in nature some of the time. So, grounding, pausing, allowing stillness and quiet, um, connecting with others, that sense of what we can do in community. Um, We've got quite an emphasis on stretch and play, which is, again, the YSP connections gives us some of that, which is, how do we actually playfully and enjoyably stretch our boundaries and allow ourselves to play and fail and so on in a safe space. And then the last one is hope, really, which is that kind of sense of the possibility of things being better. So those are some of the practices we're attending to, but there will be many others that would attract other people, but those are what we're giving some attention to.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. Because, I suppose I'm sitting here listening, Jane, and I'm thinking, well, um, trusting that wisdom is trusting that center is I suppose something that from my own experience of working on myself, but then also some of the work I'm doing with my clients when I'm connecting, when we're working with some of these ethics,
Yes.
that's because I suppose that sense of how am I trying to explain it? So if we're taking that space, if we're helping them connect to this wisdom, um, there's also learning to trust it, isn't there? I imagine.
Yes, and yes, there is. And again, we were talking earlier before the call started about what happens to us I was talking about what happens to me in different situations when I maybe doubt it a bit, and I have to feel it. I have to let it surface and sometimes be cautious that what's going on. But I feel it. I definitely can feel it in as a sensation when I think I'm on top of something that I need to explore or express. I'm sure lots of people on the call have something similar, but that's the trusting, isn't it? But you need to know when those signals, where do those signals come from? Where do you feel them?
Mm,
Um, and I think without some time to be quiet and pause and ground and center, it's difficult to have to hear the signals sometimes.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think, I mean, coaching has evolved. I mean, I would say strong coaches now will hold more of a systemic lens, for instance,
Yeah.
in their practice, where, one of the whole principles of working systemically is you're working on behalf of the system rather than
Yeah.
an individual, so
Yeah.
that enables us to challenge the coachee perhaps in ways that we didn't years ago when it was
Yeah.
more person centered, if we think about it in that way.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so I suppose I see coaching evolving in line with some of the areas you're talking about. I suppose for me, there's a curiosity around this notion of coaches and dialogue around. I know the MCC, for example, are doing things around climate change, uh,
Yes.
but I think some more of these other threats. Yeah, I think it's interesting about who's in charge of the dialogue at the moment. If we take AI, for instance.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think AI, it's a whole area, and I know you're doing lots of thinking about it. I, I only a little bit really, but I think again, it challenges, doesn't it, some of the fundamentals around, what is it that AI can do? It can, it's an amazing spreadsheet, I think, isn't it, that can come up with lots and lots of analysis and so on. But it doesn't. It's don't let's confuse it with any emotion or any kind of moral choice. And maybe that will come, but that's not there now. So um, I think that this terrain, and the institutes are thinking hard about it, aren't they? But it, how far does the coaching community, the human coaching community, sort of stand up for what is distinctive um, about being a human coach? And for me, it is about the emotional dimensions of, care and love and lived experience and moral choice from all of that.
Hmm.
That's different. And I think it's, I think that's of great value. And I hope it won't get lost because we're all listening to AI.
Sure, sure. And at a time when when you talk about some of the ethical challenges and the disconnection that's happening, sometimes where coaching, is more and more needed. And I'm sure everybody on the screen will agree with me and listening will agree with me.
Yeah,
So, because again, we could talk for ages around
yeah,
this. I'll try and pick up on some of the comments in a minute, Jane. But so just your reflections then in terms of, I know you've said a little bit, but this question around for us as coaches finding a wise path and how we can contribute. What would be your response to that question?
well, because I sort of have this interest in wisdom, I think it's staying, staying attentive to that for ourselves first of all. How we find that for ourselves, and I suppose modelling it really, isn't it? And I am always the first to say I don't model it that well a lot of the time, but I do try and seek after it, and I try and seek to work with people who are also seeking after it, and I try and do the things, the practices that seem to me to help. So, the reflective practices, the connecting with nature and getting perspective, the quiet, the trusting, hoping that there are better ways, that sort of playful. Though, I think is practicing what you preach. Really, is for me the essence of it. I think on the sort of underlying issue of the kind of present day and the sort of ethical challenges in the world and politics at large, might be more to be done by the community at large and by the education community at large. I just don't think it gets enough attention in business schools or in institutes. It maybe does in some of the professions, perhaps in medicine and a bit more. But I just don't think we pay enough attention to the ethical intelligence. And if you read on, there is a book fairly recently published on what is wisdom and can you teach it? And it does come out with kind of, there are a few things that seem to constitute the characteristics of wisdom, which are, cognitive knowledge at one level, emotional intelligence, practical intelligence. Wisdom is enacted. It's not just something you think about. But the fourth one is about the kind of ethical intelligence. And I just feel quite strongly we do not pay enough attention to it in our education system. So that would be something the system could do, I think. But, a lot of it is personal and about the coach.
Thank you. And if there were some resources, if someone's really interested in reading more about wisdom or learning more about this, Jane, where would you point them to?
Oh, that is such a good question, Damien. I mean, there is actually a lot of writing on it now, and there's a lot of anthologies that, if you want to go the academic route, there's a lot of academic writing around it. And I would start by sort of Googling Robert Sternberg's edited editions and have a look at that as a start point. But that will then very fast take you into some, lots of newer writers and some of the newer people. I mean, I might take you towards, there is a Centre for Practical Wisdom at the University of Chicago, which is an academic group. So that's the kind of academic stuff. But if I were to say what influences me the most in terms of other stuff, non-academic stuff, it's probably other things. So things like, I don't know whether anybody reads Richard Rohr, the Centre for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque in the US. A much more spiritual but ecumenical sort of work, but that again has a really, I think, a very balancing action, reflection, orientation, and a lot more range, really, probably not as pure academic. I don't know if that helps.
Just and your book, Jane?
Well, my book, yes, my book's all right. Yeah, it's all right. Mine's called, it's a series of essays for leaders and organisation developers, if anyone's interested in that. I have a very odd way of distributing my work, which is either this is a PDF and I just send it out to anybody who wants it, because I don't think you can own wisdom. So,
okay. So if people want to contact you, you'll put your website on the chat. Yeah?
Yes, I can do that. Yeah.
Jane, anything you want to say just to bring this short dialogue, I appreciate, but to a close?
I wish I had longer to answer some of the questions, because there's some lovely things going on. And the last one I'm just reading, Debbie, and doing a course on the first term is on wisdom. I'd love to hear about it. But there's lots of good stuff. I know there's so much good stuff going on, and I just think if we could all expand it, that would be wonderful. So,
thank you. Thanks, Jane. So I'm going to bring us to a close only because of time, and I'm conscious of everyone's time. But I hope that's been interesting to listen to. I hope that's made you reflect in terms of what you're meeting in your own practice as coaches, because either implicitly or explicitly, these topics are now really starting to come into the room with the leaders that we're coaching, and I'm sure we could all resonate with that.